You probably think you know Leonardo da Vinci, the painter of the Mona Lisa, right? But what if I told you he was also a failed musician, an obsessive note-taker, and someone who never finished most of the things he started? Hi there. Tonight, I'll be telling you the slow, fascinating story of Leonardo da Vinci, one of the most curious minds the world has ever seen. This isn't just about paintings and inventions. This is about a man who saw the world differently, and kept trying to understand it, even if no one else did. Let's go all the way back to April 15, 1452. Leonardo was born in a small Tuscan town called Vinci, near Florence, Italy. That's where his last name comes from. Da Vinci literally means, from Vinci. He was born out of wedlock, the illegitimate son of a wealthy Florentine notary named Ser Piero and a peasant woman named Caterina. Because of this, Leonardo was not allowed to attend traditional universities or become a full citizen, which meant fewer opportunities. But perhaps that gave him more freedom to explore things on his own terms. From a very young age, Leonardo was described as quiet and curious. He loved being in nature, watching birds fly, and studying plants. His notebooks, even from early on, were full of sketches of animals, leaves, and human faces. He didn't just want to look at things, he wanted to know how they worked. By the time he was in his early teens, Leonardo had moved to Florence, one of the most vibrant and creative cities of the Renaissance. This was a place filled with art, architecture, poetry, and invention. It was a good place to be if you were a boy with a wild imagination. His father noticed Leonardo's talent for drawing and, around the age of 14, sent him to apprentice under Andrea del Verrocchio, a well-known painter and sculptor in Florence. This was a turning point. Verrocchio's workshop was like a factory of ideas, producing everything from religious paintings to public sculptures. Leonardo learned how to mix paints, prepare canvases, work with wood and metal, and sculpt with clay. But more importantly, he learned how to observe the world like an artist. According to some accounts, Leonardo's talent soon surpassed even his teachers. There's a famous story about Verrocchio asking Leonardo to paint an angel in one of his religious pieces. When Verrocchio saw Leonardo's angel, so delicate and lifelike, he supposedly never painted again. But Leonardo wasn't just learning how to paint. He was already developing his lifelong habit of note-taking. He carried small notebooks with him everywhere, sketching what he saw, writing down ideas, recording thoughts about anatomy, weather, architecture, and even jokes. These notebooks would one day become one of the most detailed windows into the mind of a Renaissance genius. And yet, even in this exciting and promising period, Leonardo began to show a pattern that would follow him all his life. He would start things, get deeply involved, and then, stop. He would lose interest. He would move on. His mind was always racing ahead to the next question, the next problem, the next mystery. In these early years, he also began his study of the human body, not just from the outside, but from within. He wanted to understand muscles, bones, the way people moved, and even how they expressed emotion. His drawings of anatomy are still considered some of the most accurate ever made, even by today's standards. But Leonardo wasn't famous yet. Not even close. He was still just another apprentice in Florence, working in the shadows of greater names. That was about to change. By the late 1470s, Leonardo had finished his apprenticeship with Verrocchio and began working independently in Florence. He was around 25 years old and ready to make a name for himself. But even then, his career didn't start with a bang. Florence was full of talented painters and sculptors, and Leonardo was just one among many. Still, there was something different about him, something that set him apart. Leonardo was obsessed with details. While other artists might paint a face, Leonardo would study the muscles beneath the skin, the light in the eyes, and the texture of the lips. He didn't just want his paintings to be beautiful, he wanted them to breathe. He would spend hours watching people in the street, trying to capture the way they walked, talked, or smiled. One of his early commissions was a painting for a chapel in Florence, called the Adoration of the Magi. It was supposed to show the three wise men visiting the baby Jesus. Leonardo began the work with passion, designing a complex, dramatic scene filled with emotion and movement. But, as often happened, he never finished it. The painting remains incomplete to this day, but even in its unfinished state, you can see his genius. The twisting figures, the layers of faces, the mysterious architectural background, it all feels alive. Then, something unexpected happened. In 1482, Leonardo left Florence. He traveled to Milan, a city ruled by the powerful Duke Ludovico Sforza. Why would an artist leave the artistic heart of Italy to go north? Because Leonardo wanted more than to be a painter, he wanted to be a creator of everything. When he arrived in Milan, Leonardo didn't introduce himself as an artist. He wrote a letter to the Duke offering his services as a military engineer. He promised he could build bridges, design cannons, create armored vehicles, and even develop water systems. Only at the end of the letter did he casually mention that he could also paint. That's how Leonardo thought, art was only one part of a much bigger vision. The Duke was intrigued. He brought Leonardo into his court, and there, Leonardo finally had the freedom to explore all of his interests. He painted, yes, but he also designed theatrical sets, created mechanical devices, and continued his endless studies of nature and science. He organized parties, worked on engineering problems, and began dreaming of machines that could fly. It was in Milan that Leonardo painted one of his most famous works, The Last Supper. Unlike traditional versions of the scene, Leonardo didn't just show a calm meal. He captured the moment right after Jesus tells his disciples that one of them will betray him. The reaction is explosive: shock, anger, confusion. Every apostle responds differently, and every movement feels real. But the Last Supper had a hidden flaw. Instead of using the traditional technique of painting on wet plaster, Leonardo experimented with a new method to get more detail and light. Unfortunately, it didn't last. Within just a few years, the painting began to deteriorate. Today, it survives only through careful restoration, but even in its damaged state, it remains one of the most powerful images in art history. As Leonardo's reputation grew, so did his curiosity. He kept notebooks filled with drawings of inventions that were centuries ahead of their time: helicopters, diving suits, and giant crossbows. He dissected human corpses in secret to better understand anatomy. He studied the flow of water, the shape of clouds, the flight of birds. But for all his brilliance, Leonardo still had one weakness: he rarely finished anything. He was always moving on to the next idea before the last one was complete. Patrons were often frustrated. Commissions took years, or never arrived at all. But Leonardo wasn't working for fame. He was chasing something else entirely: the deep, invisible patterns that connected everything in the world. By the 1490s, Leonardo da Vinci had firmly established himself at the court of Milan. He was no longer just an artist or an engineer, he was something harder to define. A man who lived between worlds. One day he might be designing a musical instrument shaped like a horse's head, and the next he'd be dissecting a human skull to study its geometry. Leonardo's notebooks during this period became even more elaborate. He wrote in mirror script, writing backwards from right to left, so his notes could only be read with a mirror. Historians still debate why he did this. Was it to keep his ideas secret? Or was it just more comfortable for his left-handed hand? Whatever the reason, these notebooks contain thousands of sketches: flying machines, gears, pulleys, human organs, plants, rivers, architecture, even imaginary creatures. One of Leonardo's most iconic images was created during this time: Vitruvian Man. It shows a perfectly proportioned male figure, arms and legs outstretched, inscribed in both a circle and a square. The drawing wasn't just about anatomy, it was about harmony. Leonardo believed the human body reflected the entire universe. That everything in nature, from the smallest insect to the tallest cathedral, followed the same mathematical laws. He wasn't trying to make art. He was trying to understand the code behind reality itself. But life at the court wasn't always secure. In 1499, Milan was invaded by the French. Duke Ludovico Sforza was overthrown, and with him went Leonardo's main patron. Once again, Leonardo had to move on. At nearly 50 years old, he packed his notebooks, a few unfinished works, and left Milan behind. For a while, he drifted, traveling from city to city, often working for short periods on commissions that were never completed. He went to Mantua, to Venice, then finally back to Florence. And it was in Florence that Leonardo began one of the most mysterious paintings in the history of art, La Gioconda, better known today as the Mona Lisa. No one knows exactly when Leonardo started the painting. Some believe it was around 1503. The woman in the portrait is thought to be Lisa del Giocondo, the wife of a wealthy Florentine merchant. But what's most fascinating is how long Leonardo held on to this painting. He carried it with him for years, tinkering with it, adjusting the shadows, perfecting the folds in her clothing, and deepening the expression in her face. The Mona Lisa became more than a commission. It became an obsession. He used a technique called sfumato, which means smoky in Italian. It's the gentle blending of tones and colors, so that there are no hard lines, just soft transitions, like mist. That's what gives the Mona Lisa her lifelike quality. Her smile seems to shift as you look at her. Her eyes seem to follow you. It's a painting that feels less like a picture and more like a person. But while Leonardo was mastering portraiture, he continued with his scientific investigations. He studied optics to understand how light entered the eye. He analyzed facial muscles to capture emotion more precisely. He watched how water moved through canals and rivers, recording patterns that reminded him of hair, clouds, and wind. And still, he dreamed of flight. He designed winged machines based on bats and birds, sketched parachutes, and even drew plans for a helicopter-like rotor device, centuries before anything like it would be built. He filled page after page with studies of feathers, air currents, and the muscles birds use to lift themselves from the ground. He never built a working flying machine. But that never seemed to disappoint him. Because for Leonardo, the act of observing and understanding was more important than the end result. His curiosity was endless. His failures were lessons. And every drawing, every experiment, was just another piece of a puzzle he knew he'd never complete, but would never stop trying to solve. Back in Florence in the early 1500s, Leonardo found himself in a city full of younger, ambitious artists. And one of them was rapidly rising to fame, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo was bold, proud, and full of energy. He was a sculptor who carved muscle-bound figures from marble with a force that felt almost violent. Leonardo, in contrast, was deliberate, careful, and analytical. The two men didn't like each other. And in a way, Florence became too small for both of them. There's a famous story about a public painting competition held by the city. Leonardo and Michelangelo were both asked to paint massive battle scenes on opposite walls of a government building. Leonardo began the Battle of Anghiari, a chaotic and emotional scene of soldiers locked in combat. Michelangelo began the Battle of Cassina, showing muscular Florentine fighters surprised while bathing. But neither painting was completed. Leonardo abandoned his work after experimenting with an unusual technique that caused the paint to drip down the wall. Michelangelo left Florence soon after to work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling in Rome. The rivalry between the two remained unfinished, like so many things in Leonardo's life. Still, the Battle of Anghiari lived on through copies made by other artists. Even unfinished, Leonardo's ability to show motion, fury, and emotion in a single moment was unmatched. Horses reared, men wrestled, faces twisted in rage. It was more than a painting. It was a storm frozen in time. Even as these grand projects faded, Leonardo remained restless. He accepted commissions but rarely delivered. He studied mathematics with local scholars, dissected human corpses in secret at hospitals, and filled more and more pages of his notebooks. He wasn't driven by deadlines, he was driven by questions. How does the tongue move when people speak? Why do waves ripple in certain shapes? Can emotion be measured by facial lines? In 1513, now in his early 60s, Leonardo accepted an invitation to move to Rome. There, he hoped to find support from the powerful Medici family. But the Rome of the High Renaissance was crowded with talent: Raphael, Michelangelo, Bramante. All working on massive church projects and monuments. Leonardo, despite his fame, found himself somewhat ignored. The Pope gave him a studio and a small salary, but few important commissions. While others painted chapels and built cathedrals, Leonardo experimented quietly with optics and hydraulics. He dissected animals, studied the heart, and designed complex mechanical devices. But the energy of his youth had begun to fade. He worked slower now. He drew less. He began to grow tired. Still, he kept the Mona Lisa close, often making tiny adjustments no one else would notice. The painting had become his companion, a symbol of his endless quest to capture the essence of life. Then, in 1516, a final chapter began. King Francis I of France invited Leonardo to his court, offering him the title of premier painter and engineer to the king. It was a generous offer. Leonardo would live in comfort, with the freedom to do as he pleased. He accepted. He crossed the Alps with his trusted apprentice, Francesco Melzi, bringing with him very few possessions, a few manuscripts, some tools, and 3 paintings. Among them, the Mona Lisa. He would never return to Italy. In the peaceful countryside of Amboise, France, Leonardo da Vinci spent the last years of his life far from the busy cities of Italy. He lived in a manor house called Clos Luce, not far from the royal chateau of King Francis I, who often visited him to talk, learn, and simply listen. The king admired Leonardo not just as an artist or inventor, but as a thinker, a man whose mind seemed to stretch beyond time. By now, Leonardo's body was aging. His right hand had become partially paralyzed, likely from a stroke, which made painting more difficult. But his mind remained sharp. He continued writing, sketching, and dreaming, even as his pace slowed. His notebook still filled with questions, about water, wind, the stars, and the soul. Though he was given the title of royal painter and engineer, Leonardo no longer took on grand commissions. Instead, he reflected. He organized his notes, revisited old ideas, and dictated thoughts to his assistant, Francesco Melzi, who would become the guardian of his legacy. Many of the pages Leonardo left behind were thanks to Melzi's careful preservation. The French court treated Leonardo with dignity. He dined with nobles, walked in gardens, and enjoyed long talks with the king. But perhaps what Leonardo appreciated most was the time. After decades of unfinished projects and scattered ideas, he finally had quiet days to think, not for glory, not for fame, but for the joy of understanding. He often returned to his early questions, ones that had followed him since his youth. How do birds fly? Why do trees grow the way they do? How does the human heart move blood? His final drawings include detailed studies of the human heart, capturing its chambers, valves, and flow with almost eerie precision. He was still trying to understand life at its deepest levels. On May 2, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci passed away in his bed at Clos Luce. He was 67 years old. According to legend, King Francis I was at his side, holding his hand as he died. Though this story may be romanticized, it reflects how deeply Leonardo was respected, even in a foreign land, far from his birthplace. In his will, Leonardo left most of his belongings to Melzi, including his notebooks, tools, and personal items. He requested a modest funeral and was buried in the chapel of Saint Florentine, which was later destroyed. Today, no one knows for certain where his remains rest. And yet, Leonardo never truly disappeared. He lives on in thousands of pages of notes, filled with mirror-written thoughts and mysterious sketches. In the soft smile of the Mona Lisa. In the gaze of the Vitruvian Man. In the flying machines that resemble today's helicopters. In the science of anatomy, the structure of rivers, the design of bridges, and even in the way we think about observation itself. Leonardo da Vinci wasn't just an artist. He was a bridge between worlds, between art and science, between the known and the unknown. He asked questions no one else dared to ask and followed ideas no one else thought to follow. He failed often, completed little, but inspired endlessly. And maybe that's the truest measure of genius. Not in how much you finish, but in how deeply you wonder. So tonight, as you close your eyes, think of the man who sketched the sky, studied the heart, and painted a smile that still watches the world 5 centuries later. A quiet man from Vinci, who never stopped dreaming, even centuries after his death, Leonardo da Vinci continues to whisper through history. Not in loud monuments or towering statues, but in quiet discoveries and subtle ideas, fragments of thought buried in old notebooks, half-finished sketches, and strange mirrored handwriting that modern readers still puzzle over. He left no autobiography, no grand declarations, no explanation of his life's meaning. What he left was curiosity, encoded in page after page of diagrams, symbols, and experiments. Historians still debate what kind of man Leonardo truly was. Was he lonely? Was he misunderstood? He left behind no known romantic relationships, no direct descendants, and only a few close companions. He rarely wrote about feelings. And yet, his art is full of emotion. His inventions, though impractical in his time, carry the energy of someone who refused to believe that the sky was out of reach. Leonardo's notebooks contain designs for scuba gear made from pigskin, mechanical lions that could walk, and ideal cities engineered to prevent disease. Some of his ideas were centuries ahead of the tools needed to build them. Others were entirely impossible, more imagination than science. But that never stopped him from trying. And maybe that was the point. In a world that wanted answers, Leonardo lived in the questions. While others searched for truth in textbooks, he found it in the curve of a river or the flight of a bird. He believed that nature was the greatest teacher, and he studied it with a reverence usually reserved for gods. A falling leaf, a human hand, the pattern of muscles beneath a horse's skin, all were clues in a grand design he never claimed to understand fully, but never stopped trying to read. He once wrote, "We know more about the movement of celestial bodies than about the soil beneath our feet." That sentence, quiet as it is, reveals the heart of Leonardo's mind. He wasn't just looking up to the heavens, he was looking down, around, and within. He wanted to understand everything, even if everything could never fully be known. And today, his influence is everywhere. Engineers study his bridge designs. Artists copy his anatomy studies. Medical students look at his dissections. Physicists admire his intuitions. He is quoted in museums, carved into buildings, and taught in schools. But beyond all that, Leonardo left something harder to measure, a standard for how to wonder, and a model for how to think. Not in straight lines, but in circles, spirals, and sketches in the margins. He showed that art and science are not opposites, but reflections of the same desire, to see the world not as it appears, but as it truly is beneath the surface. His Mona Lisa is not just a portrait. It is a question. A gaze that does not answer, but invites you in. A quiet reminder that some mysteries are meant to be felt, not solved. So if tonight your thoughts wander, let them. Let them drift like Leonardo's did, from stars to insects, from bridges to smiles. Let them wander, and wonder. Because maybe the greatest legacy of Leonardo da Vinci is this. That we, too, are allowed to dream without finishing. After Leonardo's death in 1519, the world didn't instantly recognize the full depth of what he had left behind. His paintings, yes, were admired. The Mona Lisa hung quietly in royal collections. The Last Supper, though already fading from the wall in Milan, was visited by artists and copied endlessly. But his notebooks, the thousands of pages filled with inventions, anatomical studies, maps, and philosophical thoughts, were scattered like leaves in the wind. Many were inherited by his loyal student, Francesco Melzi, who understood their value. But after Melzi's death, they passed through the hands of heirs who did not. Pages were lost, sold, torn, misfiled. Some ended up in dusty trunks in private homes. Others crossed borders into distant collections. Entire volumes vanished for centuries, only to reappear with water damage, wormholes, and missing sections. And so, for generations, the world remembered Leonardo as a great painter. But not as the scientist, inventor, or thinker he truly was. He became part of art history, but not yet part of the history of ideas. His notebooks, written in mirrored Italian and filled with unfinished sketches, were simply too strange, too fragmented, to understand. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that scholars began to look deeper. Slowly, they pieced together his pages, translating and cataloging what could be found. The Codex Atlanticus, a vast collection of Leonardo's notes, was assembled in Milan. Other codices, like the Codex Leicester, which would one day be purchased by Bill Gates, offered glimpses into his mind. The picture that emerged was astonishing. Here was a man who had tried to measure the sun's path, who diagrammed how blood moves through the aortic valve, who imagined machines that wouldn't exist for another 400 years. A man who saw the branching of trees as a mathematical pattern. Who thought about erosion, geology, and how fossils ended up on mountaintops. Who drew the human spine as an elegant, load-bearing spiral. Leonardo had lived in a time of superstition and dogma, but he thought like a man born centuries later. And yet, even as the modern world rediscovered him, parts of his legacy remained elusive. Many of his notebooks are still missing. Entire chapters of his thought may be lost forever, pages burned, sold, or simply forgotten. We may never know the full extent of what Leonardo explored. And perhaps that's fitting. Because Leonardo himself never chased completion. His mind was never about final answers, it was about motion. Flow. The kind of understanding that's always just beyond reach, but forever worth chasing. As the centuries passed, his image became iconic. The old man with flowing beard and penetrating eyes. A symbol of the Renaissance man, someone who refuses to be one thing. Artist, engineer, anatomist, musician, philosopher, dreamer. He blurred all lines. He once wrote, "Learning never exhausts the mind." And indeed, his own mind never truly rested. But history did rest. For a long time, it forgot just how much he had tried to teach us. Now, as more pages are digitized, translated, and studied, we begin to hear his voice again, softly, from across the centuries. Not in loud declarations, but in sketches of birds, water spirals, and mechanical wings. The voice of a man who didn't just live in the Renaissance. But was the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci didn't think in sentences or lists. He thought in shapes, in spirals, in movement. He observed the world not as something fixed, but as something constantly becoming. To him, even stillness was just motion waiting to happen. Open one of his notebooks, and you won't see orderly paragraphs. Instead, you'll find a quiet storm, sketches of muscles beside water eddies, diagrams of gears beside poems, bird wings drawn in cross-section beside the anatomy of the human foot. Arrows, loops, mirrored writing flowing from right to left. He wasn't just recording what he saw, he was building a language only he seemed to fully understand. He drew with both precision and poetry. A fetus inside a womb looks like a sculpture from marble, but beside it, tiny notes speculate about how the baby breathes, how the blood flows, how the soul enters. A diagram of a water wheel is detailed to the last tooth of the gear, but beside it are musings about rivers, erosion, and the nature of energy itself. Leonardo didn't separate science from art. To him, they were threads of the same tapestry. One day he might dissect an ox heart, the next he might design a theatrical stage set that transforms in seconds. To him, both acts required the same skill, observation without assumption. He had no formal education. He never studied Latin deeply, and much of the scholarly writing of his time was closed to him. But that gave him a freedom others didn't have. He was never trapped by tradition. He asked questions that scholars wouldn't dare ask, not because he was rebellious, but because he simply didn't know he shouldn't. For Leonardo, knowledge wasn't about collecting facts. It was about connection. He once compared the branching of trees to the flow of blood through veins. He saw the turbulence of water and recognized it in the movement of hair and smoke. He studied the geometry of crystals and found its echo in snail shells and pine cones. He believed that if you observed carefully enough, the world would reveal its hidden unity. But this kind of thinking could also be overwhelming. Leonardo was easily distracted. He often left works unfinished, not out of laziness, but because his interest had moved elsewhere. His curiosity was vast but restless. As soon as he glimpsed the shape of one mystery, his mind would reach for another. This is why so many of his paintings were abandoned in early stages. Why his inventions often remained only sketches. Why even his most famous work, the Mona Lisa, was never truly done. He took it with him everywhere, adjusting it over the years like a personal journal written in color and light. To live as Leonardo did was not always easy. He was a man out of time, too modern for the age he lived in, too unusual for the systems around him. His thoughts came faster than his tools could keep up. His ideas outran the world. But through it all, one thing never faded, the desire to understand. Whether it was the mechanics of flight, the structure of the human skull, or the way light hits a glass of water, Leonardo paid attention. And in paying attention, he honored the world. So tonight, in the quiet, let your thoughts move the way his did. Let them wander. Let them spiral. Let them connect. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary thing you can do, is simply notice. Leonardo da Vinci lived in a world of time, but he rarely obeyed it. He didn't rush. He rarely delivered works on time. He started things when inspiration struck and stopped when his curiosity wandered. Clients grew frustrated. Popes and princes sighed. But Leonardo did not measure time by calendars or contracts. He followed the rhythm of discovery. To him, a moment of insight was more valuable than a year of routine. In his notebooks, he often drew gears and escapements, parts of early clocks, trying to understand how time moved in machines. But at the same time, he observed the aging of faces, the crumbling of stone, the rings inside trees. He saw that time wasn't just measured in hours. It was carved into the world. Leonardo aged slowly in his art. His self-portraits, if they are truly of him, show a man watching his own decay with calm curiosity. Not fear. Just quiet interest. He studied death not as an end, but as a transformation. During dissections, he examined old bodies and compared them with the young. He mapped how veins hardened, how lungs lost elasticity, how the body gave itself back to the earth. But he never wrote of death with sadness. He saw it the way he saw all things, as part of nature's design. A process, not a tragedy. And perhaps this is why his work feels so timeless. The Mona Lisa, with her barely there smile, does not live in any one moment. She exists in stillness. She is always watching, always pausing, never changing. Like an idea caught between thoughts. His notebooks are the same. They do not flow like stories. They loop and jump. One page might study birds in flight. The next, a comedy about fat men slipping on ice. Then a gear, a storm cloud, a riddle, a recipe for dye. Reading them feels like entering a mind without walls, a clock without numbers. And yet, within this disorder, there is something remarkably human. Because we, too, do not think in straight lines. We remember out of order. We dream in fragments. We chase questions we'll never answer. And that is perhaps why Leonardo feels familiar, even now. He was not a genius sealed in marble. He was a human being, curious, distracted, and endlessly awake. He once wrote, "As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a well-employed life brings happy death." That was how he saw the end, not as failure or sorrow, but as rest after effort. He believed that to study the world deeply was enough. Even if he finished little, even if he left pages unwritten, the life itself, the attempt, was the masterpiece. And maybe that's what matters most. Not how many answers you find, but how many questions you are brave enough to ask. So let your mind drift now, not to conclusions, but to quiet wonder. Like Leonardo, let yourself pause. Observe. Breathe. Because in that stillness, something beautiful happens. The world opens. Leonardo da Vinci lived much of his life surrounded by people, and yet, in many ways, he was alone. Not lonely, exactly. But solitary. He kept few close companions, and trusted even fewer. His world was filled with kings and courtiers, students and assistants, but his deepest thoughts lived in the quiet margins of notebooks that no one else could read. One of the few people he did grow close to was a young apprentice named Gian Giacomo Caprati, whom Leonardo nicknamed Salai, meaning little devil. Salai was mischievous, difficult, and often untrustworthy. He stole money, caused disruptions, and argued frequently. And yet, Leonardo kept him by his side for over 2 decades. There was also Francesco Melzi, a more serious and respectful student, who inherited many of Leonardo's notes after his death. Melzi understood the weight of what he had been given, and it's because of him that much of Leonardo's work survives today. Without Melzi's care, the pages might have truly been lost. But even with these companions, Leonardo remained inward-facing. He did not write letters full of emotion. He did not speak of dreams or regrets. Instead, he observed. He measured. He reflected. His emotions were more often seen in the shading of a cheekbone or the softness of a figure's hand. He found intimacy in details. A curl of hair. The way light pools in the eye. The way the wind lifts fabric in a sudden breeze. In his paintings, people are not frozen, they breathe. They wait. And through them, maybe, we see pieces of Leonardo himself. He was not an easy man to define. He dressed well, often in rose-colored tunics. He was known to be charming, witty, even theatrical. He played instruments. He designed costumes. He loved riddles and jokes. But behind all of it was a silence, a kind of internal gravity pulling him always back to his thoughts. He was fascinated by the invisible: wind, sound, pressure, time. Things you cannot hold, only trace. Perhaps that is why his relationships were so complex. He could describe the exact force needed to lift a weight with pulleys, but not the weight of a conversation. He could draw the mechanism of a smile, but not always know when to return one. And yet, he understood beauty better than anyone. To him, beauty was not decoration. It was truth, unfiltered, mathematical, delicate. A bridge arching with perfect weight distribution. A dragonfly's wing. A storm rolling across hills. He found wonder in things others overlooked. And in that wonder, he was never alone. Because nature, to Leonardo, was always speaking. In the rustle of leaves. In the murmur of water. In the shifting of shadows on a face. He once wrote, "Nature is full of infinite causes that never occurred in experience." In other words, the world was deeper than we could ever see, and he spent his life listening to what it whispered. So as you lie here tonight, let yourself fall into that quiet. Into the same quiet Leonardo walked in, for hours, with his sketchbook in hand and questions blooming like wildflowers in his mind. Because sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries begin in silence. That in the final years of his life, Leonardo da Vinci did something rare. He slowed down. After decades of wandering across Italian courts, Florence, Milan, Rome, he accepted an invitation from a distant admirer, King Francis I of France. The king was young, curious, and deeply impressed by Leonardo's fame. In 1516, he welcomed the aging master to the Loire Valley and gave him a peaceful residence, the Château du Clos-Luz, just a short walk from the royal palace. Here, at last, Leonardo found something like rest. He arrived in France with a few paintings, the Mona Lisa among them, and many of his notebooks. He was no longer chasing commissions or escaping war. The king paid him a pension, called him "my father," and allowed him to spend his time however he pleased. And so, Leonardo walked the gardens. He watched the wind stir the trees. He studied the way river mist clung to the hills in the morning. He entertained visitors with tales of flight, with sketches of inventions, with mechanical lions that could walk and open their chests to reveal lilies. Even in old age, his mind was alive. But his body was not. He suffered a stroke that affected his right side, though he continued to write and draw with his left. He tired more easily. His walks became slower. But even then, he remained curious, writing about water, architecture, anatomy, and dreams. He still believed in observation. He still wondered about the stars. Some say he spoke often of death in these years, not with fear, but with a calm acceptance. He had studied it so long, after all. Had seen it in bones, in dust, in old trees splitting at the root. To Leonardo, death was not darkness. It was simply a step beyond sight. On May 2, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died in his room at Clos-Luz. He was 67 years old. The man who had studied everything, from the flight of birds to the soul of mankind, was finally at rest. Some legends say he died in the arms of King Francis. Others say he died alone, looking out the window toward the garden. We may never know. What we do know is that he asked to be buried in the church of Saint Florentin in Amboise. And that his grave, like much of his legacy, faded over time. The church was destroyed centuries later, and his exact resting place was lost. Today, a small tomb in the nearby chapel bears his name, but whether it holds his remains is uncertain. And yet, somehow, it doesn't matter. Because Leonardo never truly belonged to one place. Not to Florence. Not to France. Not even to time. He lived in a space between disciplines. Between centuries. Between what is and what could be. He didn't leave behind an empire or a doctrine. He left behind a question. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, that question remains. What would it mean to truly see the world, not just with your eyes, but with your mind? Not to rush through it, not to master it, but to marvel at it. To follow curiosity wherever it leads. Like Leonardo da Vinci's life was never a straight path. It was a journey without end. A search without a final map. He painted, he invented, he studied. But above all, he asked questions. Questions that led him into shadows, into light, into the very heart of mystery. He never settled. He never stopped wondering. His sketches remain like whispers from the past, unfinished, enigmatic, alive. The Mona Lisa's smile still puzzles us. His machines still inspire dreamers. His notebooks, full of spirals and symbols, remind us that the world is a place of infinite depth. Leonardo showed us that knowledge is not a destination, but a voyage. That curiosity is a flame we must carry, even when it burns beyond our reach. That beauty and science are not enemies, but partners in discovery. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the world softens, remember the quiet genius who saw wings in the sky and mysteries in the human soul. The man who drew the future before it arrived. The man who taught us to look deeply, not just at the world, but at ourselves. Because the journey never ends. And in that endless journey, there is peace. Good night.